to the channel. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Now today's video is going to be an in-depth comparison between the newly released Heimdallr Monster homage against the original Seiko Monster. Now hopefully you guys have seen my full review on the Heimdallr Monster homage, and now let's have a look at how it compares against the original. Now granted, to my right this is the Seiko Monster Gen 1, but the only differences which I have identified, at least visually, because I haven't been fortunate enough to own a Gen 2 Seiko as of yet, is basically the dial and also the crown. Now I don't think there's any other substantial differences between the two, but of course I could be wrong as I haven't seen it in the flesh. However, this comparison, we're going to use a couple of pictures because I've studied some detailed pictures of the Gen 2, but for the most part, in terms of at least the case finishing, the handsets used, etc., it is going to be exactly the same, because between Gen 1 and Gen 2 measurements, specifications, they are pretty much exactly the same, apart from the fact that there was a different crown as mentioned and the movement was upgraded as well. And no doubt Heimdallr have proved that this is a very impressive homage that they've done. So in the review I've gone through all the details that I can just on the watch, as well as mentioning some points for improvement. So in this video we're not going to talk about the improvements, we're just going to see how it compares like for like against the Gen 1. What I do want to show is that how close Heimdallr actually are to the genuine article and how well of a job they've done. I mean, they've got it right to the finer details. So within the comparison, you are going to see some microscopic shots, you're going to see some macro shots, and hopefully I've done that to give you guys a proper understanding of how far Heimdallr have really gone into homaging that finer detail. Now I'll take this opportunity to apologize beforehand. Some of the shots, they're a bit shaky, you know, I had to use my hands, and the microscopic shots, I'm using a cheap microscope to be honest, so there's a bit of fuzziness and there's a bit of image error, so apologies to those visual perfectionists, but you will definitely get the gist. So as per usual with my usual comparisons, we're going to break it down by the features. So we're going to look at the dial, hands, chapter ring, bezel, crystal, case. So before I go any further within the comparison, if you haven't done so already, please take this opportunity to hit that subscribe button and also hit that notifications bell so you're up to date with all the latest reviews. Also check the links in the description. There'll be affiliated links from AliExpress. There'll also be a link to my eBay store and also my email address if any of you guys would like to contact me for anything, questions, etc. I don't mind at all. Now with that said and done, let's proceed. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the actual dial. So you can see the hour markers, they are very similar to the Gen 2 hour markers. The only key differences being is the color of the lume and the actual hour markers themselves. So for those with that keen eye for detail, you'll see on the Gen 2 that there is a very slight difference between the hour markers on the Gen 2 and this Heimdallr homage. And that's due to the way that Seiko have applied the lume on these hour markers. You can see a very fine shading around the hour markers, which adds up just that little bit of more depth to the actual markers, whereas the Heimdallr, they look a lot flatter. But that's a very minor difference. Now, moving on to that, you'll see the similarity, which is Heimdallr have also done this polished frame around the hour markers in black, which is also present on the original Gen 2. Now in terms of the color difference on the lume, the Heimdallr here is actually closer to the Gen 1 Seiko Monster because of the greenish tinge that's apparent. Now Heimdallr of course used the C3 Super Luminova and Seiko used their proprietary Seiko Lume Bright. So now cue the microscopic shots. I had a lot of fun taking these. So these are just microscopic shots of the actual hour markers, but look how crisp and clear they are. Just look at the quality of the application and the printing and the application of the lume. Now you will also see some discrepancies. I did find a couple of lines on the chapter ring where the printing was slightly off, but for the most part they've done exceptionally well, where the printing is actually really spot on. Now within this microscopic sort of comparison between the two, I came across a few things which the naked eye cannot see. So on the Heimdallr Monster, you'll see the tips of the hour hand and the minute hand. They've got this slight little defect. Now, like I said, naked eye, you cannot see it, and there's actually no reason for them to be perfect, especially with the price point in mind. So you can see that slight discrepancy on that printing on that chapter ring. But again, to the naked eye, it isn't visual, but it's just worth looking at how well they actually have managed to do this. Now look at the printing on the dial with the text. Very crisp and very clear. There's actually no fade at all. Very legible and overall very good quality. Now we're going to compare this now to the Gen 1. So you'll also see on this Gen 1 that when we move over to the printing, it isn't as crisp. There's actually, it's quite patchy in some parts as well, which is obviously a lot more visible. But I want to go down to this level and this detail to show you how effective Heimdallr have actually been. So we're going to go across the chapter ring. You can see that slight bit of fading on the white. But you know, to be fair to the Gen 1, it is an old watch. So maybe there was a difference in printing. Obviously, they've gone a lot better. And also, we don't know if the chapter ring has experienced any aging or fading. Now, that one's particularly bad on that side of it. But perhaps, you know, as mentioned, let's give the Gen 1 a bit of credit and let's put age into it as well. But when we do look at things like the handset, the Gen 1, the handset used is very, very good. Obviously, it is better than the one of the Heimdallr. You'll see on the pinpoints, there's actually no defect that we've seen on the Heimdallr's hands. Now, while we're on the handset, let's talk about another difference. Now, this was pointed out by a very eagle-eyed subscriber, and that is regarding the minute hand. Now, the minute hand between the Heimdallr and the Seiko is, the Seiko has a hand which is a lot broader, and in fact, the actual minute hand on the Heimdallr is a lot closer to the handset used on the Seiko 5 Baby Monster. So slight difference, but overall visually, I don't think it impacts it at all. But a very good catch by one of the subscribers, so thank you for that. Now for the final difference that you'll see on the dial, we need to look at the chapter ring. Now the chapter ring on the Heimdallr isn't actually applied to the dial directly. It is a full chapter ring. If you look at the 12-hour marker, you'll see the actual thickness of the chapter ring. Now, if we compare that to the genuine Seiko, you'll see that the chapter ring is slightly thinner and it doesn't give you this gap that it is visible. Now, because of this difference, I think the Seiko does have a better aesthetic overall when looking at the dial, and it does sit so much better than it does on the Heimdallr. Now, when it comes to the crystal, Heimdallr are using a domed sapphire crystal, and it is a single dome, and so do Seiko use a domed mineral crystal. Apart from the fact that there is a difference in material and Heimdallr are using a superior material to Seiko on this one, they also have a visual difference, that being the Heimdallr uses a chamfered edge. Now, I am a fan of chamfered edges, but in this case, I do prefer the non-chamfered crystal used. I think that gives it a better fit and finish and overall visual to the actual dial and case. But that might be a subjective thing, so I'll leave it for you guys to be the judges of that. Now let's turn our focus to the actual bezel, and let's mention the main thing which is going to stand out to everybody, and that is the illuminated pip at the 12 o'clock on the bezel. Now on the Heimdallr, it is slightly protruding, it is sticking out of the pip, but it is well encased within that enamel. And you can see the one on the Seiko, very flush subset, and that is the one that I prefer. Now, we really need to look further than that in order to fully appreciate how well Heimdallr has actually finished this bezel and how it has in fact surpassed the Gen on a few different levels. So let's look at the brushing. Now, Heimdallr has used circular brushing as per the brushing on the Seiko as well. Done really well. The markers have also been applied really well. There's actually virtually no difference, but this is where Heimdallr has, for me, smashed it out the park. Now the bezel does have this polished lip, which you can see clearly, and this is the Heimdallr, and look how well they've actually done that compared to the Seiko as well. And you also got the polished centers, which is within the grips of the actual bezel. Now looking at the Seiko, you can see that same polished lip. Now please excuse the condition of this watch, obviously it is battered, so that's going to impact that overall look. But going back to this Heimdallr, look at the brushing that you've got on those splines on that bezel and the polishing in between the center. So they've done quite a lot. They've transitioned from brushed to polished to brushed and polished. So look at the amount of work that has actually gone into the Heimdallr, and now put that in comparison with what you guys are paying for them. So I don't know how they've done it, but I love the fact that they have paid so much attention to detail and got it exactly right. And some of the lines are a lot clearer. They're a lot more refined, I'd say, than the Seiko, but I still want to bear in mind that this is quite an old watch and it has taken a bit of a beating in its time. Now from the bezel to the case, this is where we are going to see a next difference, and pay attention to those gaps within the case just below the bezel, which are aligned to the bezel where you would grip it. You can see the shape is a funnel shape, and now when we compare this to the Seiko, we'll actually see the difference is on the Heimdallr it is narrower, and as mentioned it is a funnel shape, whereas the Heimdallr on the bottom of the case you can see that they are a lot more rectangular and it is quite a bit wider. I don't have a preference either or. I don't think either or is better. I think that's just a visual difference which you will see on the Heimdallr. In terms of bezel, grip, it doesn't impact it at all on either one. Now Heimdallr have also followed this attention to detail through to the shroud as well. So let's look at these half shrouds on the Heimdallr, and you can see you've got this circular brushing along that chamfered edge of that shroud and also across the tips of the lugs. Now these lugs are faceted, you do have a few different angles present, and you can see that brushing is very consistent across all the facets, and between the lugs you'll see that it is highly polished and it has been done to a very high standard, and that meets the side of the lugs and the side of the shroud where you've got linear brushing. So that transition between circular and linear is done perfectly, and also you'll see the difference between the lines. They are very crisp and clear, and you can definitely see the different surfaces. So that is, you know, great attention to detail from Heimdallr. Now we're going to compare that to the Seiko and you'll see exactly the same, but the lines on the Seiko are not as prominent. And looking at that from my eyes, I'd say the Heimdallr is outperforming the Seiko, at least to this respect. So the lines are present, the dimensions are present. Obviously Heimdallr has copied the Seiko Monster case, but their lines are just so much clearer, so much crisper, and that isn't because this Seiko is a bit old, but the brushing, the transitioning between the facets of the case, I think they've done exceptionally well when we do compare it to the Seiko. Now Heimdallr haven't just stopped there, they've also followed this up onto the back of the watch. So the case back, you can see that it's highly polished, similar to the Seiko, but pay attention to this lug right here. Look at that crease. Now that's only present on one of the actual lugs, and look, it is present on the Seiko as well. That is really great attention to detail from Heimdallr. Now the last thing to look at on the case is the actual crown. Now there is a difference between this crown and the one used on the Gen 2, and that is in a couple of things. One is the knurling, one is the size of the actual crown, and the crown tube on the Heimdallr is slightly bigger, so that will affect part compatibility. Now moving on to the bracelet, you'll see that they're using those half H links with the polished male part to that link. So you got linear brushing across there and the polishing as mentioned, and you also got a tapered design. But let's just take a closer look at this brushing. It's flawless, it's so pleasing to look at, and it is so similar to the Gen. It's actually very difficult to tell them apart, from the tapering down to the design. Look at the polishing in between, superb. Now, but what I'm going to go further to say now, this is probably one of the best bracelets that I have handled. They've actually done this thing that I've mentioned in a couple of videos, and I mentioned it in the unboxing, that you've got this really smooth feel to the bracelet, which I have not seen on AliExpress watches, to be honest. So even around these edges, and look at the sides of the links, look, there's no sharpness present. It has been smoothed over. It's had that final polish or trim or whatever it's had, and that has proven to be very effective. superbly smooth and very OEM feel. Now, what I will say in regards to the clasp, yes, this does have a milled clasp, but I don't think the Seiko clasp is bad at all. Number one, it is way more functional than these milled clasps. The finishing is a lot better. It is a lot smoother. It doesn't matter that it's actually stamped because they've got that, that little groove in there, which does strengthen the feel. It's also got a very nice sound when you do close it, and as well as a dive extension. So for me, that's a much more functional clasp than these milled clasps. Now these milled clasps, the only thing which, let's be honest, what we like is just the centerpiece, which is that scissor style milled clasp. The rest of it is quite uncomfortable. You've got sharp edges around there, which you don't find on the Seiko clasps. A lot of people do complain about the rattle, but I like the sound. Like I mentioned, it for me is a lot more functional than the clasp that you see on this bracelet. Let's compare the lume between both these watches. So the one on top is the Gen Seiko, and the one underneath is the Heimdallr. And the Heimdallr does use a very, very powerful lume, obviously C3 Super Luminova, but Seiko Lume Bright actually has better longevity than the C3. C3 initially appears a lot brighter, but with the Seiko it's tried, tested. Also, you see a slight color difference. There's a tiny blue hue to the one in the Seiko, and obviously it's a lot greener in the Heimdallr. Both are fantastic. I think both are very adequate, sufficient for what you need it, but your Seiko will definitely last longer and you'll see it for a longer period of time. So now we're on the last leg of the review, and I've kept dimensions till last. Now this is the icing on the cake, and I really want to look at the dimensions now just to prove and just show how close this really is to the actual monster. So dimensions, 42.2 on the Seiko and 42.2 on the Heimdallr. I measured it just from here to here, just from the widest part of the case. Now then we look at the thickness, 13.7 on the Seiko and 13.4. Lug to lug, 47.6 on the Seiko and 47.7 on the Heimdallr. Now, if we look at it from an engineer's perspective, that's a tolerance of 0.3 millimeters. That is crazy. Even though they used a obviously Gen 2 Seiko, and they're saying it's a 1.1, even from a tolerance perspective, as mentioned from an engineer's perspective, that is really tight. Look how close the dimensions are. 0.3 is negligible. Now weight, without the bracelet, without the strap on this Seiko, the Seiko comes in at 90 grams and the Heimdallr at 93, so 3 gram difference. So now we can summarize. I think after the review, yes, the watch is impressive. A lot of people do like the watch, the ones that have received it. I want to do this just to show how close and how well and how far they've actually gone and what they're charging. It's actually exceptional what they've achieved. So just to summarize, I've been talking about how similar it is, but if you notice on every aspect that we reviewed, so the dial, the hand, the chapter ring, bezel, the crystal, the case, the crown, and even the bracelet, even though this one doesn't have a bracelet, there are slight differences in each and every aspect. Dial, you've got the yellow lume, better printing. For example, if you picked up the hand, you've got the difference in the hour hand, and chapter ring difference. You've got a difference in the bezel where, in regards to the pip, the crystal is slightly different. The case is slightly different when it comes to the those little recesses at the bottom. Also, the crown is slightly different, and the bracelet is slightly different due to the clasp. So I think that's quite interesting. But to summarize it all, obviously some aspects with regards to the finishing and the fine details that we covered, especially on the case, I think Heimdallr are a little bit better. And obviously spec wise, they do beat the Seiko on specs, no doubt. But when it comes to monetary value, of course the only one that matters here is the Seiko. That is going to hold its value. That is the one between the two that is actually worth, it has a price to it. Like I mentioned, the Gen 2s have picked up. So what I would say is, if you do get the chance to acquire a Seiko Gen 2, don't pass it up. Even with regards to a Gen 1, there's a lot of purists out there that do prefer the Seiko Gen 1, and they find the indices bit better and they prefer them, and that's absolutely fine. So if you do get the chance to buy these, buy them. Obviously it is a different feel, but this is an awesome alternative and it will help scratch that itch until you get the real one. So that's my overall review. I hope you guys found it interesting and enjoyed that, because I really did enjoy making it. I think, you know, I could have missed slight bits, you know, probably. So if you do notice them, mention them in the comments. And thank you guys for watching, like always, and I'll see you on the next review.